일단 경비구역에 나타난 자는 예고 없이 사격하라. 죽은 자만의 비밀이 지킨다. 이게
The snow was falling hard that winter day when Kang Jin decided he would rather die than continue living. Standing at the edge of the Amnok River, the frozen waters separating North Korea from China, he knew that crossing meant either freedom or death. Behind him lay 13 years of secrets so dark, so twisted, that even now, safe in South Korea, he struggles to speak them aloud. But Kang Jin didn't die that day. He survived to become one of the only people on Earth who can tell us what really happens behind the gates of Kim Jong-un's secret compounds. The parties, the women, and the unimaginable luxury existing just miles from where ordinary North Koreans collapse from starvation on the streets. What you're about to hear isn't from intelligence reports or satellite images. This is the testimony of a man who stood guard while the Kim family indulged in pleasures so extreme, so divorced from the reality of their starving nation, that it fundamentally broke his faith in everything he'd been taught to believe. This is the story of Unit 974, North Korea's most elite bodyguard force, and the horrifying truth about what happens when absolute power meets absolute secrecy. Kang Jin was just 17 years old when the officials came to his school. Out of 25 million North Koreans, only a few hundred teenagers would be selected that year for the supreme honor of protecting the supreme leader. The selection criteria were ruthlessly specific. Perfect family background traced back 3 generations, exceptional physical beauty and strength, and most importantly, absolute loyalty to the Kim dynasty. The boys who made it through were told they were entering paradise. They would serve at the Tukgak, the special villas where the Kim family resided. They would witness greatness. They would become part of history. What they weren't told was that once they entered Unit 974, they wouldn't be allowed to leave for 13 years. They wouldn't be told that their lives now belonged entirely to the state. And most importantly, they wouldn't be told about the parties.
한 30-40명이 이 안에 들어가서 이제 남자 5-6명을 해서 놀거든요. 그런 걸 많이 목격했습니다.
The Changsong compound sits exactly where North Korea meets China, built into mountainous terrain so remote that satellites can barely penetrate the natural cover. 4 kilometers from Chinese territory, the location was chosen with surgical precision. Close enough to flee if the regime fell, far enough to remain in North Korean control, impossible to attack without triggering an international incident. Here, in temperatures that plummet to -30 degrees Celsius, 3,400 guards maintain a pleasure palace that would make ancient Roman emperors blush.
마당에는 또 이제 못 치게 해요. 아이들을 위하고 기쁨조를 위한 이게 노루마당이 돼가지고 그쪽에 못 치게 하죠. 눈싸움으로 막 합니다.
The compound sprawled across pristine wilderness, featuring horse riding grounds where Kim would gallop on white stallions like something from a propaganda poster, private ski slopes, a yacht harbor despite being nowhere near the ocean, and buildings whose purposes were so secret that guards were shot for asking questions. But it was what happened after dark that truly revealed the nature of the regime.
이 센트럴한 데서 저녁 8시, 늦은 10시 이때부터 이제 차들이 들어와서 풍착풍착 하면서 그 놀기 싸움은 새벽 한 2-3시까지 막 놀았어요.
8 o'clock. That's when the cars would begin arriving. By 10, the music would start, and not the revolutionary anthems that blared from public speakers across North Korea, but jazz, American pop, South Korean K-pop, all the music that ordinary citizens could be executed for possessing. The parties would run until 2, sometimes 3 in the morning, and the guards would stand in the freezing cold, listening to laughter and music drifting from windows they were forbidden to look through. But they knew what was happening inside, because of the women. They called them the Gipyeomjo, or the Joy Brigade. Girls between 17 and 20 years old, selected from across North Korea for their extraordinary beauty, brought to the compounds in buses with blacked-out windows.
17살부터 20살 요 미만이에요. 성인도 안 된 그 이제 성검 사람 다 해가지고 이것도 그때는 옷가라고 지금 여자들 들어왔는데 제일 이쁘고 북한에선 제일 키 크고 제일 멋진 나들이 이런 특가 관련을 들어요.
These young women were divided into three groups: dancers, singers, and masseuses. But everyone knew these categories were meaningless once the parties began. 30 to 40 women would be brought in to entertain 5 or 6 men from Kim's inner circle. They would disappear inside the center building and wouldn't emerge until dawn, if they emerged at all. The ones who pleased the leadership might stay for weeks, months, even years, trapped in luxury prisons where they had everything except freedom.
김정일이 들어왔다 하게 되면 이 안에서 나가지 못해요. 행사 끝나고 2달이든 석 달이든 이 안에서 대기를 했다가 임시각에 장군님 호출하게 되면 관련들이 다 가거든요. 공연 안 하더라고 다 같이 놀아.
Inside the party rooms, tables groaned under the weight of delicacies most North Koreans couldn't even imagine. Lobster flown in from Japan, wine from France worth more than a typical family would see in a lifetime, Russian caviar, Swiss chocolates, American whiskey, all of it smuggled through elaborate networks while UN sanctions supposedly strangled the regime. Kim Jong-il would hold court at the center table, drinking Hennessy cognac that cost $2,000 a bottle, while his people boiled grass to survive. The parties followed a grotesque routine that Kang observed for 13 years. First came dinner. Multiple courses of international cuisine are prepared by chefs kidnapped from abroad or trained in secret culinary schools. Then came the entertainment. The Joy Brigade would perform carefully choreographed dances, sing songs praising the leadership, and gradually, as the alcohol flowed, the performances would become more intimate, more degrading.
그 장군님이 다 이렇게 아끼는 관련들이란 말이에요. 그거 감히 우리 경호처라고 말했다는 큰일 나지.
But perhaps the most chilling aspect wasn't the debauchery itself. It was the bureaucracy of pleasure. Everything was documented, catalogued, and systematized. There were officials whose only job was recruiting new girls for the Joy Brigade, scouring schools and villages for the prettiest teenagers. There were doctors who examined the girls weekly, ensuring they were clean for the leadership's use. There were teachers who instructed them in the arts of pleasure, though what exactly they taught remains too dark for even Kang to fully describe. The girls who aged out of the Joy Brigade, if they survived, were sometimes married off to lower-ranking officials as rewards for loyalty. Others simply disappeared. Meanwhile, outside the compound walls, a different reality existed, one that Kang had been shielded from during his 13 years of service. The guards lived in isolation at the compounds, rarely allowed to leave. They were told they were protecting the prosperity of North Korea, but they were never allowed to see what that prosperity looked like for ordinary people. When Kang was finally discharged at age 30, he experienced the real North Korea for the first time as an adult. The image burned into his mind. Bodies at the train station that no one had the strength or will to move. This was the North Korea he had been protecting, a country where death had become so common that corpses were simply ignored, stepped over like debris. While he had been guarding warehouses full of imported delicacies, his own military family was surviving on porridge, his parents forced to trade in the markets just to eat. This was the reality for most North Koreans. While exact statistics from inside the hermetic state are difficult to verify, UN agencies estimate that about 40% of the population, over 10 million people, are undernourished. The World Food Program reports that chronic food insecurity affects millions, with the average citizen receiving government rations that provide only basic sustenance when they're available at all. The psychological torture of this contradiction ate at the guards constantly. They were fed better than average citizens. They had to be strong enough to stand guard for hours in freezing temperatures, but it was just enough to keep them functional, not comfortable.
음식물 나머지 찌꺼기들이 이 오물장아다 있거든요. 납불령, 술, 담배 그걸 생각해 보면은 하도 우리는 사상 교육할 때 우리 장군님께서 잠깐 휴식한다는데 보면
The parties became more frequent, more elaborate. New compounds were built with even more sophisticated security systems. The Joy Brigade was expanded, with girls now recruited from universities and performing arts schools under the guise of patriotic service. The technology has upgraded too. Where once the compounds relied on human surveillance, now there were cameras everywhere, motion sensors, heat detectors. The guards themselves became surveilled, their every movement tracked and analyzed. Phones were forbidden, of course, but even private conversations were dangerous. Hidden microphones were everywhere, and anyone could be an informant. It was in this atmosphere of total surveillance and absolute corruption that Kang's faith finally shattered. The breaking point came when his wife died of tuberculosis, a completely treatable disease that killed thousands in North Korea, simply because antibiotics were reserved for the elite. She died gasping for breath while he stood guard outside parties where champagne was poured onto the floor for amusement. After 13 years of service, Kang was discharged with honors. He was promised his pick of university placement, any career he wanted, the rewards for those who had kept the secrets. But when he applied to work at the state's security department, he was rejected. The reason, he discovered, was that a distant relative, someone he'd never even met, had been labeled a traitor decades ago. 13 years of absolute loyalty meant nothing. The system he'd protected, that had taken his youth, his conscience, and ultimately his wife, discarded him like trash the moment a bureaucrat found a blemish in his family tree. The psychological collapse was total. Everything he'd believed, everything he'd sacrificed for, revealed itself as a lie built on lies. The decision to defect wasn't made in a moment of courage, but in one of complete desperation. The aunt who had escaped to South Korea years earlier managed to send him money through Chinese brokers. 2 million won, a fortune that could have fed his family for years. But instead of relief, the money brought only more pain. If such wealth existed in the outside world, if his aunt could send such amounts casually, then everything about North Korean superiority was false. He began helping other families, split by the regime, reconnect with relatives who had escaped. It was dangerous work, requiring bribes and secret meetings, Chinese phones and encrypted messages. When one of his contacts was arrested and tortured, Kang's name came up. The Ministry of State Security began investigating. He had perhaps days before they came for him. He had no choice but to defect.
대낮에 이제 겨울에 이제 압록강을 건넜어요.
Halfway across, he wanted to turn back, to accept whatever punishment awaited, because at least it would be warm. But he thought of his wife dying while the elite drank champagne, thought of the girls in the Joy Brigade who would never escape, thought of the guards still standing in the snow, believing their suffering meant something.
요만 뭐 손톱 눈가만한 희망을 가지고 어쨌든 넘어왔죠. 죽기 살기로.
He made it to China, then eventually to South Korea, where he now lives under an assumed name, always looking over his shoulder, always wondering if today is the day North Korean agents find him. Speaking out puts him at enormous risk. The regime has assassinated defectors for far less. But silence feels like complicity. The compounds still operate today. Right now, as you watch this, there are teenagers standing in the North Korean cold, protecting parties they'll never attend, feasts they'll never taste, believing their suffering serves a greater purpose. The Joy Brigade still recruits girls who should be studying, or falling in love, or dreaming of their futures, not learning how to please men old enough to be their grandfathers. Kim Jong-un still rides his white horses and hosts his champagne parties while his people eat grass. The system Kang escaped continues, refined and perfected over 3 generations of dictatorship, a machine that turns human beings into either slaves or monsters, with nothing in between. Kang Jin's testimony isn't just about exposing the Kim regime's corruption. It's about the psychology of totalitarianism, the machinery of oppression, and the human cost of absolute power. It's about young men turned into automatons, young women turned into objects, and an entire nation turned into a vast prison, where the guards are as trapped as the inmates. The parties continue. The girls still arrive in their buses. The guards still stand in the cold. But now, at least, one man has lived to tell the truth. And in a regime built entirely on lies, perhaps truth is the most dangerous weapon of all.